Hey everyone, it's Mir, and I just came back from London in EGX 2022, where I had my first chance to play Street Fighter 6. I got hands-on in the game for several hours over the course of 4 days, and I have lots to say about this game. First, let me mention that the footage in the background was kindly recorded by FlawlessDeku. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a good tripod for the life of me. But there's lots more on this channel, I suggest you check it out. It is pretty high-level footage, especially considering how early we are in the lifespan of the game. Now, first things first, let me say a couple of things about the setups. Unfortunately, they weren't quite perfect. The PC setups especially had monitors that had quite a bit of screen tearing. The PS5 setups that they set up later were on TVs, although they were on game mode. Some of the monitors felt like they weren't even running at 60 FPS, it was a little bit weird, and there was a bit of extra delay on the TVs. But overall, the game felt very responsive, especially for something that is not even out yet, and if we compare it with Street Fighter 5 at this stage of development, the difference is massive. So this bodes very well for the release of the game. They can just, get better from here. I have to say, the visuals are great in person, especially on those PS5 TVs. The colors were really good and you could see the details quite well. Unfortunately, the PC setups had no sound and the venue was quite loud. Luckily enough, the sound is probably the thing that we lose out on the least by looking at footage, so we can use that for comparison. Now let's move on straight to the gameplay impressions. The first thing that people say when they play Street Fighter 6 is that it feels a little bit heavier, chunkier, and I think it's because there's a lot more recovery on normals and pokes compared to other games like Street Fighter 5 or Street Fighter 4. The dashes are slower overall as well, so there's more commitment. There might be some extra pre-jump frames, although I wasn't quite able to test that, and it could be because of the slight delay on the monitors. I personally like how this feels, but I have to say it will take some getting used to, especially if you're coming from Street Fighter 5. There's plenty of situations where, for example, I throw a fireball and dash after it, and then I get hit because I don't have time to block, for example, or you dash after someone to try and get Oki, but your dash is so slow that you get jabbed on their wake up, for example. Having said that, the movement is good across all the playable characters that we had at the build, which I should mention is the latest available, which is the one that has Ken as well. I would say that Chun-Li seems to be the fastest on the ground as far as movement speed is concerned, and then right after Juri and Kimberly seem also slightly faster than average. On top of that, Juri has really good dashes, they go very far, and then everyone else seems to be on a similar level of speed. This helps making the neutral feel quite good. Everyone has really good buttons and movement. There's barely any proximity blocks, so you can space effectively. And as such, there's a lot of whiff punishing, so you cannot just mash on normals carelessly. A lot of characters also have some strong cancelable buttons that can convert into drive rush, for example, or in general a knockdown, so whiffing in their face can be really dangerous. Longer, more powerful normals that are hard to outspace lose to drive impact, like for example Gao's upside down kick or a Juri standing heavy kick. Even if they are unsafe, heavies tend to have pretty big pushback. Usually sweeps don't, but they can still be tricky to punish, especially if you're at range. Cancelable mediums and heavies make for good buffers, but again, they can lose to drive impact. However, if you don't buffer and just react, you can cancel into your own drive impact to counter them. So there is this mind gaming neutral where basically you're trying to make the opponent use their own drive impact so you can counter it with your own. Also, drive impact cannot punish fireballs on reaction for the most part, so there's still a reason to use them for spacing and preventing the opponent from moving forward. There's less anti-projectile moves in general. Throwing projectiles doesn't feel nearly as limiting as it was in Street Fighter 5, for example, where almost everyone had an anti-projectile move. One of the best ways of getting through projectiles is the perfect parry, as it has less recovery, so that's a good way of closing in the gap with people that are throwing a lot of fireballs without taking the extra risk of jumping. Once you get close, however, point blank, pressure is actually relatively limited. Obviously there's a lot of defensive options and backwalking is very strong. As I mentioned before, there's barely any proximity blocks, so you can walk out of a lot of block strings and tick throws, for example. This makes slow pokes very strong, by the way, because obviously there's a lot of backwalking, so if you can clip him in the legs, it's really valuable for your character, especially if you can convert into drive rush, for example. Again, drive impact prevents people from just doing buffers into safe moves on offense carelessly, because usually these safe moves have a lot of recovery, so you're able to just blow through them. You can use parry as it pushes the opponent away from you rather than you being pushed back in the corner, so it helps you maintain screen position. And it also builds drive, of course. The drive reversal has really bad range, unfortunately, but it blows up a lot of offense, and it's honestly quite good investment for 2 bars, and it can help you in a lot of situations where you feel like you're being pushed too much towards the corner. Another reason why offense is not nearly as powerful is because most mediums are barely plus on block. They don't frame trap into each other, for example, very often. They seem to be like +1 or +2 on block at most, and they kind of have some pushback that prevents them from being just, you know, used a lot, like in Street Fighter V, for example. However, there's a lot of tick throw situations again, because the throws have quite a lot of range, and you can often walk out of these for sure, but at the same time, if you're just sitting there, then the threat is absolutely real. Trades happen all the time on the ground, especially since people know that the mediums are not very plus, so they often challenge. You'll see a lot of trading in the footage that we have. So learning a trade combo in the future is going to be very useful, as this happens all the time. Especially if a light trades with a heavy, you can get the opportunity to combo afterwards. So that could be a very good way of optimizing and landing some extra damage here and there. Now, make it sound like offense is pretty bad, but actually landing hits is really rewarding. You can convert into drive rush to get damage and corner carry, especially for rushdown characters. This is really valuable. Supers can lead to a lot of damage. Of course, they drain your opponent's drive gauge, so it limits them on resources. In general, the damage is pretty good, even for simple basic combos. The scaling system supports this. If you get 1 or 2 hits, you can still deal pretty significant damage. Now, this leads me on to the topic of combos. I would say that in difficulty, they're pretty similar to Street Fighter V. It has the same input buffer, it feels like. The timing is a little bit different because the moves have longer recovery than Street Fighter V. So for example, in my case, I found myself dropping certain combos that overall were quite easy otherwise, just because I was going too fast. There's a lot of good variety when it comes to combos, especially because there's a lot of drive rush options and there's a lot of opportunity to use meter in different ways. You can spend it on OD or even multiple ODs in the same combo, use supers. There's a lot to unpack here. Since counter hits and punish counters are really common, you can get some pretty impressive combos going. Most characters seem to have really good frame data on hit as well in this build. And with the extra frames that you get from the various mechanics, some of the links remind me a lot of the Street Fighter 4. Like for example, stuff like lights into heavies. Luckily enough, we can do that without the screwed up frame data from Street Fighter 4, so that's nice. As I mentioned, one of the most common situations in this game is the punish counter scenario, which obviously happens a lot when you're punishing unsafe moves. As I mentioned, it can lead to big damage because of the conversions that you can get off of this. So depending on how unsafe the move is, the punish counter combos can get really crazy and quite strong, especially if you add in drive rush to the mix. Even when a move is pretty safe or barely minus, like -4 or -5, that sort of thing, some characters can pick up a punish from pretty far away because the lights are so plus that can combo into mediums and such. And if you have a cancelable medium with good range, you can then continue the combo from there. One of the most peculiar things about Street Fighter 6 that has been mentioned in the past, but I finally got to experience myself, is the resource management, both for the drive gauge and the super bar. I would say the drive is more available than traditional meter, obviously because it recharges over time, most notably, and you get it from hitting opponents quite easily. More opportunity to use overdrive moves than in previous games. There's a lot of OD fireballs going on in Fireball Wars, which are pretty important because in this game, overdrive fireballs always go through non-overdrive fireballs, even if the number of hits doesn't match. Like a 2-hitting OD fireball will beat a 3-hitting normal fireball, for example. Rushdown characters will want to use a lot of normal cancelled into drive rush, especially versus zoners to convert and get Oki and corner carry. So that's a more expensive use of drive, but still very valuable because then you get the opportunity to pressure on the wake up and possibly gain all the drive back. I often found myself not using supers because there's a lot to keep track of, especially level 1s, because you kind of have to think about them in advance when you're doing your combo, because you have to use it in lieu of a special rather than after the special most of the time, because it's only cancelable from special cancelable normals. But they're still pretty useful when I did remember. Some characters are level 2s with really good utility and damage, and you see those quite often, like for example Kimberly's level 2 being an air super and cancelable from air combos. But the ones that I've seen the most are the level 3s, as a lot of people ended up just stocking enough meter to have a level 3, and they're really damaging, especially when you get a critical arc. You can easily do 40% or more just with a couple of hits and very basic combos. Like I mentioned, all supers are still very valuable, and they're all important to use, both for defense and the drive gauge drain on the opponent, and in general, some of the extra properties that they might have. When it comes to the drive meter, most of the time you'll lose all of your drive and go into burnout only if you're careless on how you spend it. It's really kind of hard to lose all your drive just to blocking and getting punish countered, unless, again, you're really careless, because you need to be blocking a lot to actually lose everything. Parry helps quite a bit in block strings, especially if they start being predictable. Obviously, the perfect parry gives you a chance to turn the tides, but at the same time, you also can use it to get drive back, which is, again, extremely valuable. Managing drive didn't feel too bad to me, but sometimes you will want to spend and be low on drive because it's important to convert into pressure, for example, or get out of a dangerous situation. So sometimes you'll be forced to take risks and then play conservatively later because you're just out of drive gauge. Even when playing defensive characters, sometimes you will want to go all in just to build up space. A great example would be spending your remaining meter on an overdrive move to win, for example, a fireball war, but at least that gets you out of that situation. Now, this leads me to talk about Burnout. Now, Burnout feels extremely restrictive, which is obviously intentional. The biggest change is that it's very easy to get pushed to the corner for two main reasons. One is that you have way less options to deal with your opponent's drive mechanics, most notably drive impact. So it's very easy for the opponent to just do block strings that force you to block drive impact, and they will push you towards the corner. And obviously, if you're already in the corner, then the drive impact is extremely scary, as it will stun you if you hit the wall. The other thing is that in Burnout, you actually suffer more block stun. And as such, it's difficult to challenge most block strings because they are all more plus. So for example, medium into medium I mentioned earlier, it doesn't actually work most of the time, but it does in Burnout because of the extra block stun. So on top of the fact that you don't have any drive mechanics to defend yourself, you also have to take much more offense. You are rewarded for blocking correctly, but as I mentioned, you're gonna get pushed to the corner pretty easily, so you have to be very mindful of your position on the screen. As I was suggesting, it becomes really scary in the corner. Normal into drive impact, as a cancel for example, is basically a checkmate if you don't have a super, because you cannot interrupt in between, and if you try to jump, very often you're gonna get hit, especially because there's more block stun, and as such the gap is even smaller than it normally would be. Even if you have a super stock, it can be kind of hard to react, especially if you compare it to just pressing two buttons of your own drive impact. You have to do a complicated motion, and the gap is not very big. In some matchups, it's easier to wait out the Burnout, especially if it's a neutral heavy matchup, but you might take a lot of chip from fireballs, for example, during this time, so you're not completely safe even in that case. Sometimes it happens that both characters are put in Burnout, especially if there's unintentional meter usage on both sides, and everyone jokes that this is the super turbo mode. A lot of people tend to also forget of chip outs from specials. This can happen during Burnout. It's not like Street Fighter V where it's only supers. And I have to say the chip on special moves is also quite high during Burnout, which again is probably intentional because it's the only situation in which you can actually take chip damage. I guess it's a good point in the video to address some of the concerns that people have with Street Fighter 6 looking at the footage. A lot of those neutral skipping moves are usually reactable. For example, if someone is doing drive rush in neutral a lot, neutral jumping and drive impact are good options. Fireballs stuff that kind of strategy pretty reliably, and advancing active moves are good for this as well. The meta at the event, especially over the course of the 4 days, became more pressing parry in neutral and holding it for a little bit, and only drive rush if you see them whiff something or kind of freeze up, because the freeze gives you the opportunity to close in the distance and maybe get a punish or start your offense. Normal dashes are slower, as I mentioned, but they're still useful to catch people off guard. Unlike drive impact and drive rush, They don't have any colorful visual tell to them. I actually got caught with dash up throw very often as I was worried about other stuff. With time you'll be able to stop them with normals. I occasionally could. Again, the dashes are slower, so if you're looking out for them, it's definitely possible. But if you're, overwhelmed by all the mechanics, it can definitely happen. You will have to get used to dealing with that as well. Some characters like Jury, for example, have really good dashes and drive rush, which I think are built into her archetype of being a speed character, as they call it. For example, her drive rush into steady medium kick is pretty silly, and it could be problematic because it's this very active move with decent range that can be turned into something that's plus on block with drive rush, so it's kind of difficult to stop. But there are options against it. For example, it loses to neutral jump and early drive impact. So it's not a silver bullet, there's still answers against it. The overheads on most characters seem to be safe, like for example Jury's or Kimberly. Gal's overhead, for example, is only -4. They seem fast, but they're still reactable. It's definitely gonna get better with training. It could just be that the animations look different from how they do in Street Fighter V, so maybe that's why I'm thinking they're faster. They might just be, again, like I said, different animations. The parry neutralizes the overhead low threat as well, so that helps in defense if you think that it's coming. Most lose to drive impact pretty bad because they have a lot of recovery, and if you can react with DI rather than just blocking, it's a big punish. So maybe that's why they made them safe on block. This is also the answer to drive rush overhead, for example, that a lot of people find really scary because you can combo off of many drive rush overheads. Some characters have so Unga Bunga moves that are plus or hard to deal with at the moment, but they seem reactable, although they will require some training. A great example would be Ken's heavy Dragon Lash kick. That one's plus on block, but it is quite slow. So if you manage to DI through it, or parry it, or do a reversal before it hits you, those are all great options to deal with it. Another concern is the burnout in the corner. If you're burnt out in the corner, a normal into drive impact is a really hard situation to deal with. You cannot jump out of a heavy into drive impact, sometimes even mediums, especially because, as I mentioned before, during burnout you do take more block stun. Sometimes you might intentionally get counter hit by the normal so that the drive impact combos and then it doesn't splat you, but then you're put in the same situation again. It's just horrible if you don't have super. I don't think I've solved this situation yet. The only answer seems to be you need to have super and you need to do it in the gap, which, to be honest, I don't particularly like, but there could be something that I'm missing, so we'll see. It might also change in future builds. Then again, this situation could be intentional because they want you to really avoid burnout, and as I mentioned before, it's very easy to get put in the corner when you're in burnout, so it might just be their way of rewarding someone for correctly depleting the opponent's gauge or for punishing them for being careless. I would conclude by saying that honestly the game is amazing so far. I had really so much fun with Street Fighter 6. It was very enjoyable to play. I think I also very much appreciated the fact that there were a lot of people, especially from the UK and European FGC, that came out to try the game. So there was a really good environment of people trying to learn and experiment with different things. So it was enjoyable on that front as well, the human aspect of it. It's just a very good look for Street Fighter 6. To be honest, it was almost more than I had expected. There's just lots of interaction in this game. You never really get put in a situation where you don't know what to do, aside from that burnout that I just mentioned. And it seems like both the people that really liked Street Fighter 4 but didn't like Street Fighter 5 and the people that like Street Fighter 5 are very much enjoying Street Fighter 6, which is great because it's going to bring back those communities together and overall have a bigger community for Street Fighter 6 on top of all the new people that are going to come in. Obviously, the game is probably not perfect and there's gonna be things that we're going to find out when the game releases or when the beta is out that we want changed. But again, I think it's a really good look for Street Fighter 6. The balancing seems quite on point. I'm just really excited to try it out again when the beta drops, and I hope that everyone will enjoy it as well, because I sure did. Now that was it for my video on impressions on Street Fighter 6. There's way more that we can go over. There's a lot of discoveries we've made about mechanics and things that happen in Street Fighter 6 that we weren't quite sure how they worked, but now we have a better idea, and we're gonna make more videos about that in the future. So please stay tuned to the channel, like, subscribe, so that you're not gonna miss these new videos, and I'll just see you again soon. Bye.